Picture this, a carnival of banners and torchlight along the crooked streets of Renaissance Rome. The air thick with citrus smoke and the tang of cheap wine. People packed shoulder to shoulder to watch a marriage meant to change the balance of power in Italy. At the centre of it all is a woman whose name the city will hiss and whisper for generations. Lucrezia Borgia. She arrives like a painted statue, hair braided with pearls, a veil dusted with gold thread, silk whispering against marble steps. The crowd applauds, the trumpets blare, and somewhere, buried under the music, a rumour begins, half laughed, half swallowed, that will follow her like a shadow for the rest of her life, 3 times in one night. That phrase, impossible and obscene, does the work of a needle. It pricks curiosity, then pulls, and soon everyone is threaded into a story that is part history, part gossip, and all theatre. But to understand why that whisper burns so hot, you need to see the stage. The Borgias are not merely a family. They are a machine of ambition. Rodrigo Borgia sits in robes of scarlet and purple as Pope Alexander VI, a man who has made the papacy into a throne of family advantage, arranging marriages and alliances like pieces on a chessboard. In that climate, Lucrezia is both jewel and pawn, beautiful, intelligent, and terrifyingly useful. Men move her across the map. A marriage here, an alliance there. Each knot meant to bind power tighter to the Borgia name. Lucrezia's beauty is described in every surviving whisper. Portraits flatter and poets swoon, but the real power of her presence lies in something less tangible. The way she commands a room without raising her voice. The quiet arithmetic of her glances that can turn a conversation. She is the kind of woman people notice and pass on in stories. So when scandal attaches itself to her, it finds fertile soil. Renaissance Italy drinks scandal like vinegar. The city loves a tale of sin and secrecy, especially when it can be dressed up as morality. Add politics and religion and a father willing to do anything for influence. And the rumours become a weapon just as sharp as a dagger. Now imagine the private rooms where these public plays are rehearsed. The Borgias prefer velvet and ritual. Dinners end in conspiratorial laughter. Letters pass, hand to hand, promising favours and dismissing enemies. Inside those walled gardens, truth and fiction cuddle each other like lovers. A whisper that Lucrezia's bed had been used to poison a rival could be started as easily as a cup of wine was offered. A tale about intimacy crossing the sacred border between family and desire could be invented with the right enemy and the right motive. And motive, in the Borgia world, is never in short supply. Because the charge that sticks, that Lucrezia was involved in orgies, poisonings, or indecent alliances, has 2 features that make it sticky. First, it confirms a pre-written script people already want to believe, that the Borgias are monstrous, corrupt, and dangerously godless. Second, it plays on a deeper human fascination. The image of a woman who appears to wield power through beauty and charm, and thus must be hiding a monstrous appetite beneath. This is not modern feminism. This is a seed planted in a soil of fear. To call Lucrezia a temptress is to simplify the dangerous calculus of her survival. To believe the rumour about 3 times in one night is to accept a portrait made more of projection than fact. But rumours don't flourish without witnesses, or at least what passes for witnesses. Enter the ex-lovers, the betrayed clients, the political rivals who think a slander is a currency. They whisper into the ears of poets, scribes, and foreign ambassadors who carry their letters home like plague. The Venetian envoy pens a report. The Spanish court reads it and is delighted. Each retelling is an act of amplification. Details grow, motives harden. The impossible becomes deliciously plausible. The Borgia's enemies do not need to prove everything. They need a scandal that hums loud enough that people start to fill in blank spaces with their own worst imaginings. So what does Lucrezia herself do in the face of this noise? She smiles in portraits. She bears pregnancies. She performs the role required of her, wife, mother, signatory to alliances, with a kind of composed efficiency that is almost terrifying in its steadiness. There are moments when the record shows a woman making what appear to be deliberate choices, letters of patronage, alliances with humanists, the discreet exchange of gifts and property that suggests Lucrezia was not merely swept along, but knew how to paddle a small boat through the tidal politics of papal Rome. Yet as soon as she moves, someone calls it manipulation. Whenever she rests, someone calls it indolence. The very acts that might be interpreted as agency are used instead to paint her as a schemer. This inversion is crucial to how scandal becomes history. The more a woman acts, the more likely her actions will be recoded as evidence of a dangerous, inhuman will. Now listen to how the scandal grows. An enemy publishes a pamphlet, a crude, venomous little thing, that hints at a wild wedding night, a night of obscene excess. The author knows that an image of excess sells better than the truth. He wants readers to imagine a woman who uses intimacy as currency, who gives herself away and takes power with the same breath. The image is vivid, candles guttering, bedsheets rumpled 3 times over, couplings performed as a demonstration of control. It's a perfect narrative object, compact, shocking, and easily repeated. Storytellers bite down on it like hungry dogs. Within months, the tale has morphed. The once odd whisper becomes a moral fable about corruption and the danger of beauty. But if we slow down and look closer, the scandal reveals more about those who tell it than about the woman at its centre. What does a society say about itself when it prefers the lurid claim to the complicated truth? What does it mean that a rumour about 3 times in one night can carry more weight than a carefully recorded deed? The answer circles back to power. People want simple explanations for complex events. They want villains to pin their fear and envy on. Lucrezia's story gives them a convenient target. It is easier to shout monster than to describe the grinding, incremental mechanics of alliance building, the quotidian violence of diplomacy, the compromises that make survival possible. And yet beneath the clamour, a different story waits, quieter, lined with documents and contracts rather than pamphlets and rumour. In those pages, Lucrezia signs deeds of land, shows kindness to friends, patronises artists, and steers her household with a rigour that suggests competence, even care. These acts are less sensational, but they are more revealing in the long run. Here is a woman finding ways to exert influence inside the narrow channels allowed to her, sketching a life in margins where power sometimes hides. If the scandal tells you how others wanted to view her, the surviving records tell you how she actually navigated a perilous world. So when you hear that scandalous line 3 times in one night, don't accept it as gospel. Hear it as a bell that tolls louder for those who wish to entertain themselves with myth. Ask instead, who benefits from this story? Who loses when the rumour is believed? Because history, at its core, is often the story of whose whispers get stamped into paper and whose voices are left out in the street. Lucrezia Borgia's life becomes, in many ways, a test of gossip, of power, and of our willingness to see people in their full, messy complexity, rather than as caricatures that satisfy our appetite for outrage. When the match no longer suits Rodrigo's designs, the machinery of annulment whirs into motion. The Sforza marriage is dissolved on grounds that read like a ledger of male impotence and social convenience. Publicly, the claim is that Giovanni could not consummate the marriage, an accusation that lands like a blade in a world that equated marital prowess with honour. Privately, it reeks of convenience. The annulment severs Giovanni's legal rights and clears Lucrezia for a new, more valuable alliance. For her, the personal cost is invisible on the contract but brutal in practice. A public reappraisal of her worth, a stain that will always be used by enemies who want to paint her as either a hapless pawn or a cunning temptress. Next comes the match that will scar Lucrezia's reputation for centuries, her marriage to Alfonso of Aragon, the illegitimate son of King Alfonso II of Naples. To the chroniclers and pamphleteers hungry for sensation, this union reads like a doom-smitten romance. The wedding itself is sumptuous, a tapestry of banners in the garden, music stitched into the evening. And for a few shining months, the couple appears genuinely happy, but the court is a pressure cooker of loyalties, jealousies, and latent violence. Rome bristles with men who measure advantage in coin and blood. The Naples faction and the Borgia household have little patience for those who might withhold obedience. Alfonso's end is sudden, brutal, and perfectly calibrated for rumour. One night in the Borgia's palace, he is seized and murdered, stabbed, historians tell us, in the street or dragged into a private garden where his life is snuffed out. Fingers point in every direction. Some allege a jealous husband, others name Cesare Borgia and his political ambitions, and a chorus of foreign ambassadors, each with their own grudge, narrates a version that best suits their court's gossip. The story that sticks, though, is the one with the sharpest edges. That Lucrezia was complicit, that her bed was a site of betrayal, and that she either stood aside or actively arranged for Alfonso's death. It's a tidy narrative for enemies to repeat. A woman who uses her marriage to accelerate her family's power and then discards her husband like an unwanted garment. But the tidy narrative collapses when you pry into motives and documents. Contemporary letters and legal records suggest a more complicated interplay. Alfonso was politically isolated, vulnerable to rival claims, and caught between factions within Naples and Rome. The Borgias gain from his death, yes. But those who die in political storms often leave behind an afterimage crafted by those who survived. It is also worth noting that in a culture that equated a woman's sexual life with her moral core, allegations about Lucrezia's conduct were a particularly effective weapon. To call her faithless or monstrous was not merely to attack her character, it was to discredit every alliance she represented, to make enemies of those who ought to be her protectors. While courts trade in rumour, Lucrezia begins to learn the deeper arts of survival. She writes letters, dry, efficient, sometimes witty, that reveal a woman who understands legal nuance and economic leverage. She signs off on land grants, arranges dowries, and carefully positions her children and household. When marriage after marriage falls like dominoes, she adapts. Her third major public coupling, this one to Alfonso d'Este of Ferrara, is negotiated with a different tone, less a pawns transfer, and more a brokered alliance engineered with a diplomat's eye. The Ferrara marriage will last and will change the story the world tells about Lucrezia, but not before the old charges follow her, like persistent gulls. It's crucial to recognise how much of Lucrezia's vilification rests on the ease with which misogynistic tropes translate into political advantage. Calling a powerful woman a poisoner or a whore does more work than a logical rebuke. It collapses political complexity into moral simplicity. In Renaissance pamphlets and later chronicles, such charges are often cushioned with candid relish. Juicy details, invented lovers, a calendar of nights filled with obscene excess. The 3 times in one night line functions perfectly here because it is compact, memorable, and outrageous. It requires no corroboration to be effective. Once uttered, the human mind fills further details, and the rumour becomes more plausible through repetition alone. Yet if you lean in close to the archival material, a different contour of Lucrezia emerges. She exchanges letters with artists and humanists. She commissions works of charity. She negotiates the redemption of debtors and the settlement of legal disputes. Her household accounts reveal expenses for palaces and patronage, not just for sumptuous clothes and jewellery. These are the slow, patient acts that power often disguises as trivial. They allow a woman with limited formal authority to cultivate loyalties and build influence in the margins. If gossip erases complexity to simplify blame, these documents insist on it. Lucrezia is not merely a symbol of greed or lust. She's a manager of resources, a patron of culture, and occasionally, a woman capable of tenderness. So what do we make of the poisonous stories? Some historians, and a growing number of modern biographers, argue that the most lurid accusations are the product of a specific political moment. A papacy accused of corruption, a family network that threatened other dynasties, and a Europe of courts that loved scandal the way some eras love war. Others admit that the Borgia house was ruthless in its pursuit of power, and that ruthlessness often involved moral compromises. But between outright demonization and uncritical exoneration lies a truth that feels more human and more unsettling. Lucrezia lived within structures that compelled certain choices. When she exercised agency, she was often recoded as wicked. When she endured, she was judged weak. In both cases, the narrative bent toward a simpler moral framework, one easier to spread through pamphlets and taverns than the truth ever could be. This is where the rumour's power has its most interesting effect. It forces us to ask why we prefer simple tales of sin to complicated stories of survival. It reveals as much about the storytellers as about Lucrezia herself. And it sets the stage for the next phase of her life, where images of decadence will collide with acts of governance, and where the woman who was once painted as a seductress must become unmistakably a duchess with legal authority and a reputation to manage. The marriage to Alfonso d'Este is the pivot in Lucrezia's life, where rumour and reality start to diverge in ways that matter. Ferrara is not Rome. It is a court with its own rhythms, its own rules, and a duke who is less likely to be moved by papal favour than by steel and negotiation. Alfonso receives Lucrezia not as a plaything to be bartered, but as a partner whose household can bring useful capital, social, cultural, and dynastic. From the moment she steps across the threshold of the Este Palace, the choreography of her life shifts. She will no longer be merely the daughter of a pope. She will be a duchess whose name must carry weight in a region where armies and marriages both decide the map. If you listen to the chroniclers, the narrative shifts immediately. Lucrezia, the scheming temptress, becomes Lucrezia, the capable duchess. But the truth, like most truths in history, lives in the smaller acts that escape pamphlets and caricature. She organises her household with an administrator's eye. She writes letters that manage estates, resolve disputes, and direct patronage. She steps into a role that confers real legal responsibilities, managing dowries, arranging inheritances, allocating rents. In a world where the line between public power and domestic authority is thin, these acts accumulate into influence. This is not to say scandal disappears. It follows like a shadow, in part because the old stories are easy to retell, and in part because enemies still prefer distortion to nuance. But Ferrara gives Lucrezia breathing room. Here she patronises artists, entertains poets, and invites scholars. She uses culture as a tool, not merely to beautify her image, but to knit the court together. The commissions she sponsors are not vanity projects only. They are deliberate investments in soft power. Paintings and palaces carry messages: stability, refinement, legitimacy. A duchess who surrounds herself with learning and art is harder to dismiss as merely sinful. She becomes, instead, an indispensable node in a network of influence that includes merchants, bankers, and neighbouring rulers. There is a tenderness to the Ferrara years that most scandal sellers ignore. Lucrezia gives birth to children who will secure alliances and continue dynastic lines. The record shows her as a mother in ways that pamphlets rarely bother to acknowledge, arranging tutors and choosing marriages for her offspring with a steady, pragmatic hand. This quiet domestic labour, often coded as trivial in male-centred chronicles, is the mortar of dynastic continuity. It is also the place where a woman with limited formal power can exert a strategic influence, shaping the next generation and, by extension, the policies that will rule long after her own tenure ends. But Ferrara is also a stage for subtle power plays. Alfonso is no fool. He understands the political capital Lucrezia brings and the dangers she embodies for his court. He tolerates her agency, but not without testing it. There are moments of tension, disputes over patronage, rivalries between households, the inevitable jealousies that arise when a duchess maintains strong ties to a papal family whose reputation is both a blessing and a liability. The two must negotiate a marriage that is part partnership and part diplomatic compact. The negotiations are not always graceful, yet they are essential. In these interactions, Lucrezia learns, if she had not already, how to wield compromise as a kind of power. She knows which battles to fight and which to let slide into the mechanics of governance. And what of the whisper that began her public life? The 3 times in one night line is still flung by enemies like mud. But in Ferrara, it loses some of its poisonous efficacy. The court there is less interested in moral outrage and more invested in stability. Patrons and artists prefer to be close to power that supports them. Merchants prefer contracts that do not depend on gossip. Slowly, over years of steady administration, Lucrezia's public image accrues new data points: charities, legal settlements, and protected artists. The rumour remains, but it competes with evidence. That competition is why historical reputations shift. Relentless rumour needs moments of steady action to blunt its effect, and Ferrara supplies many of those moments. There is also a quieter psychological transformation worth noting. In the early years, Lucrezia's life is defined by being moved. From one marriage to another. From one palace to another. An object in a map of alliances. In Ferrara, she becomes, increasingly, an actor who can initiate. She learns to write laws of household and to command loyalty not by fear, but by cultivating reciprocal obligations. Favours extended, pensions granted, protectors made. This pattern is profoundly pragmatic. Power in Renaissance courts often worked through webs of obligation. A duchess who can summon those webs when necessary is effectively powerful, even if her authority never appears on a formal list of edicts. Still, the past is not fully exercised. Foreign diplomats continue to trade in scandal. Poets still write with relish of what courts find titillating. There are those who cannot forgive Lucrezia for existing as both beautiful and competent. Some chroniclers recode her acts of patronage as calculative bribes. Others insist that maternal care was merely another performance to secure sympathy. These readings tell us more about the anxieties of the era, anxieties about female agency, about papal corruption, about the mixing of sacred and secular power, than they tell us about a single woman's moral core. The persistence of such readings highlights a central truth. Once an image lodges in the cultural imagination, it becomes sticky, passed down through retellings that prefer a clear villain to a messy human being. Yet if we accept that reputations are contested terrains, Ferrara shows us how contestation can be partially won. Lucrezia's name becomes associated increasingly with patronage and governance. Artists remember her commissions. Legal clerks remember her signatures. The material record accumulates in her favour. Even some later chroniclers who enjoyed scandal concede, sometimes begrudgingly, that there was a steadiness to her tenure in Ferrara that merited respect. That grudging respect matters because history, at its core, is an argument about evidence. The more acts you leave on paper that point one way, the harder it becomes for rumour alone to define you. There is a human cost to this slow reclamation, though. For Lucrezia, reputation management requires constant vigilance. A single misstep, an ill-timed letter, an overheard conversation, a factional attack could reopen the old wounds. And she knows this in the intimate way of someone who has seen pamphleteers rip apart a life before. She learns to be careful with language, to cultivate alliances that can act as buffers, and to use public acts of charity as shields. These are acts of survival as much as acts of governance. They are the pragmatic choices of someone who has been weaponized by rumour and thus must weaponize civility in return. By the time Lucrezia's Ferrara years deepen, the image most useful to her enemies has lost some of its venom. Not eliminated, scandal has a long tail, but diluted. Her life becomes a case study in how reputation, even when wounded, can be reshaped by steady administration, cultural patronage, and the hard arithmetic of family politics. She will never fully escape the shadows of her origin story. Few people do. But Ferrara gives her the tools to rewrite much of the narrative, to move from being the subject of gossip to being a maker of policies and a patron of the arts. It is here, in the monotony of estate ledgers and the slow bloom of civic projects, that a new legacy quietly takes root. The years that follow Lucrezia's arrival in Ferrara are not a neat denouement so much as a slow weaving of a new life. One made from modest fabrics of duty, tenderness, and the unglamorous arithmetic of governance. Picture mornings in the ducal palace, sunlight on a tiled courtyard, the distant clatter of carts, a clerk's steady scratching as inventories are taken and rents tallied. These are the small, unromantic acts that constitute power when power is domestic rather than spectacular. Lucrezia moves through them with a discipline that seems almost astonished at its own persistence. Where once her days might have been counted in marriages arranged and rumours aroused, now they are measured in the careful management of dowries, the choice of tutors for children, and the negotiation of treaties that, to an outside eye, look suspiciously like ordinary paperwork. Yet ordinary does not mean insignificant. Each signed parchment, each charity disbursed, accumulates authority in ways that pamphlets cannot easily dissolve. Lucrezia understands this intimacy. She writes letters not as ornaments, but as instruments of policy. She ensures that contracts are honoured, that disputes among landlords are mediated, that artists who paint her portrait or carve a chapel receive stipends that will bind them to her household. Patronage is not only vanity, it is a lattice of obligations that can be called upon in moments of crisis. Over time, those obligations become a measure of her political capital, less visible than a banner or a legion, but often more durable. There is tenderness too, and it matters. Lucrezia's role as mother is in the records painfully plain. Nursery accounts, lists of nurses and tutors, the meticulous arrangements for marriages of her offspring. These acts read like small resistances against the narrative that would reduce her to appetite or poison. Being a mother, raising a household, choosing a marriage for a daughter. These are not theatrical gestures, they are durable generational interventions. They are also, importantly, acts that place Lucrezia inside the social fabric of Ferrara rather than outside it. People talk about who protects whom and who owes what. Her children become living guarantees of alliances, and through them her name roots itself in a future that outlasts gossip. But power rarely comes without friction. In Ferrara, Lucrezia must constantly navigate the ambivalence of a court that admires and doubts her in equal measure. Alfonso d'Este is a husband who understands the advantages she brings and the dangers she carries. He tolerates her independence so long as it does not threaten his own rule. There are moments of minor scandal. A quarrel over a household appointment, a jealous whisper about favour shown to a particular artist. And Lucrezia meets these with what looks like a practical humility. She pays fines, adjusts patronage lists, reassigns appointments. These adjustments are not capitulations. They are the grammar of survival in a court, where every social slight can bloom into political consequence. Outside Ferrara, the old whispers do not die. Foreign diplomats continue to exchange salacious notes, and the presses in other cities churn out lurid pamphlets because scandal sells. But a curious thing happens. The very persistence of these rumours begins to erode their potency. When every envoy writes the same thing, readers begin to sense a pattern of repetition rather than revelation. Meanwhile, in Ferrara, real people remember the kindnesses Lucrezia extended. A widow given a pension, a scholar granted a commission, and those memories spread in quieter, slower waves. Reputation becomes less a single image and more a mosaic. In time, the mosaic contains enough tiles of competence and care that the caricature, while still visible, no longer defines the whole picture. Then there is the question of mortality and the small, inescapable tragedies that refine character. Lucrezia experiences the loss and uncertainty common to women of her era. Infant deaths, childbirth complications, the perpetual threat of epidemic. Each loss is not merely personal grief. It is a political event because heirs matter and because grief reshapes alliances. Yet in these darker moments, she displays another side of her resilience, a capacity to turn private sorrow outward into public duty. Where some might retreat into seclusion, she sometimes throws herself into acts of charity, founding hospitals or endowing chapels, not to wash her name clean, but to stitch a practical usefulness onto the memory of a life that might otherwise be reduced to scandal. And then there is the slow, complicated work of legacy. Lucrezia, like any figure whose life is contested, lives inside two histories at once. The history recorded in official ledgers and patronage lists, and the history told in taverns and foreign courts. The former is accumulative and granular. The latter is performative and memorable. Which of these survives depends not only on what she does, but on who tells the story, and why. When the immediate political stakes have faded, when the papacy no longer needs to explain a contemporary scandal, or when a rival dynasty no longer needs a villain, the taste for gossip diminishes. The careful records remain. Legal documents, property transfers, and artistic commissions are harder to lampoon. They persist in archives and, crucially, they provide future historians with materials that complicate the old tale. This is where the question of agency becomes crucial. We can ask, with modern eyes and modern moral categories, whether Lucrezia was complicit in the darker projects of her family, or whether she was a survivor, making the best of the narrow routes available to her. The answer, inevitably, is somewhere between absolution and condemnation. Her life exhibits both adaptation and accommodation. There are moments when she endorses policies that further family power, and moments when she resists or redirects those same currents toward caring civic ends. To insist on a single moral framing is to flatten a complicated life into a single headline. Lucrezia's lived experience resists such flattening. It insists on complexity. As the final years of her life approach, the question that historians return to is not only what Lucrezia did, but what her story reveals about the era that produced her. The temptation to turn her into a myth, either saint or sinner, reflects a broader human desire for clean narratives. Yet history's work, at its best, is to tolerate messiness, to hold multiple motives, to map conflicting loyalties, to show how structures shape choices. Lucrezia's life, lived at the intersection of papal ambition and dynastic strategy, forces us to reckon with the ways in which gender shapes agency and how rumour becomes a political tool in the hands of those who profit from simplification. So when the pamphlets call her poisoner and when the poets call her siren, remember that those labels are not neutral. They are weapons. They are meant to reduce complex social manoeuvring into a moral spectacle. Lucrezia herself, in retiring occasionally to the quiet of her private chapel, or in dictating a letter to a trusted steward, performed the kind of unglamorous, unrepeatable labour that slowly, stubbornly, alters the ledger entries by which posterity judges a life. That is her quieter and ultimately more durable legacy. Not a single scandalous night, but decades of daily governance, patronage, and care that transformed rumour into record. The slow unravelling of the Borgia project begins not with a single dramatic act, but with a series of quiet failures and loud betrayals that a decade of rumour cannot cover. Power built on pliant alliances and purchased loyalties is brittle when the weather turns. A wronged cardinal, an unpaid subsidy, a rival who learns to walk in step with public outrage. Cesare Borgia's military ambitions overreach. Rodrigo's papal politics leave enemies with time to gather and lawyers with time to write. The papacy that once moved like a tide, raising the Borgia family on its back, loses its momentum. Courts that once courted the Pope's favour now hedge, and the old network of reciprocal obligations creaks. For Lucrezia, who has learned how to tend the small springs of influence, the change of seasons is lethal in ways both personal and political. When the storm arrives, it is partly external and partly the inevitable blowback of a family whose very success made it a target. Allies choose safety over spectacle. Mercenary captains sell their services elsewhere. In Rome, the mood shifts from indulgence to suspicion. In foreign courts, the pamphleteers sharpen their pens. The papal household that once seemed invincible finds itself exposed. This larger collapse refracts into Lucrezia's life in agonizingly concrete terms. The patronage that once protected her becomes thinner. The papal purse empties faster than it refills. Her name, once a profitable commodity, becomes a liability to those who would have patronized her. A woman who had learned the ledger now watches columns reverse. At this point, the human details matter more than grand theory. Lucrezia's letters, those instruments of administration that had quietly accrued influence, suddenly function as proof that once you have power, you also have enemies who will pass every line for a scandal. Correspondences are intercepted or quoted out of context. An instruction to secure a dowry becomes evidence for a plot. A request for funds for a chapel is recast as bribery. The very tools she used to accumulate soft power become the raw material for renewed attack. It's a grim lesson in how reputational economies operate. When the market for scandal is hot, even mundane acts are mined for outrage. There are tragic personal turns too. The deaths that any noble family must endure, infant mortality, sudden illness, the toll of childbirth, pile on the strain of politics. Grief is not private in such households. It is a thing managed, displayed, used as diplomatic capital or as fodder for the gossips. Lucrezia's personal losses, piled atop the external collapse of Borgia influence, create a pressure that would have been hard for anyone to withstand. Her endurance in these years is not the flashy resilience of a heroine in a romance. It is a quieter, stoic management of sorrow, of ceremonies to honour the dead, and legal steps to secure inheritance. That quiet labour, again, is how lives are preserved when headlines turn hostile. Then comes the practical reconfiguration. When the papal court can no longer guarantee safety, Lucrezia's most valuable asset becomes the protective network she personally cultivated in Ferrara. Alfonso d'Este's court, previously a place where her reputation had been somewhat normalised, now offers a refuge that is also conditional. She brings to Ferrara the weight of a name that can still split opinion. She brings children with claims and marriages pending. She brings the experience to run a household in crisis. Ferrara, in some sense, becomes both shield and mirror. It reflects the new limits of her power and shelters what still matters: family, property, and the slow accrual of local loyalty. In these years, the gap between myth and archive becomes particularly instructive. Pamphlets still circulate, painters still render Lucrezia with an ambiguous smile for those who favour scandal. But in notarial archives, in the quiet scratch of clerks, a more mundane story continues. Lands are transferred, dowries paid, wills witnessed. These documents don't make headlines, but they make history. They show a woman engaged in legal acts that matter for generations, arrangements that secure pensions for widows, clauses that protect orphans. This is not the stuff of tavern talk, but it is the stuff that cushioned families and ensured stability. To read both the scandal and the notarial pages together is to see how easily spectacle tries to swallow substance, and how substance in the end often outlives spectacle. As the final chapter of her life approaches, Lucrezia's choices become shaped by an awareness of legacy in a literal sense. How will her name be remembered? Which of the many versions of her life, poisoner, patron, pawn, duchess, will stick? She moves, when she can, toward acts that create durable marks: donations for hospitals, endowments for chapels, commissions that add brick and fresco to Ferrara's civic life. These are not grand gestures of self-promotion so much as insurance policies against erasure. They are also, frankly, expressions of a temperament that had long ago learned to value continuity over spectacle. Patronage, at its most humane, is an act of saying, "We will continue," a promise to posterity that there is something worth preserving. There is also, in these twilight years, a political rebalancing that is not the triumph some biographies imply, nor the complete surrender others insist upon. Lucrezia never regains the kind of centrality in Italian politics she had been forced into as a Borgia scion. But she does secure for her immediate family a space in the network of Italian principalities that will carry them forward. That kind of achievement is small-scale and technical: marriage contracts, feudal rights, regional pacts, but it is also profoundly consequential. Dynastic continuity is the slow arithmetic of history. Managing it well means that your grandchildren may live in security, even if your name is whispered in scandal. And finally, there is the afterlife of stories. Once Lucrezia dies, the rumour machines do not simply switch off. They seed later centuries with clichés and caricatures that find fresh lovers in Enlightenment writers, romantic poets, and eventually modern novelists and filmmakers. Each era remodels her story to fit its anxieties: a cautionary tale of Catholic corruption in one century, an eroticised boogie woman in another. Yet the archival traces remain, waiting for historians who want complexity rather than caricature. In modern reassessments, scholars have unearthed the documents that tell a less sensational story: a life of administration, patronage, suffering, and cautious agency. What Lucrezia's later years teach is not a simple moral, but a nuanced one. Reputations are constructed, weaponized, and sometimes repaired, but they are never simply the sum of a few loud lies. They are the product of choices, public and private, petty and grand, and of material records that either survive or are destroyed. Her life is proof that the labour of governance and care, though less glamorous than scandal, matters more over the long haul. It is also proof that women in history, especially those who operate in constrained spheres of formal power, often perform the invisible work that keeps dynasties and communities intact. When Lucrezia died, it was not with a trumpet, but with a series of signatures and a few whispered condolences. The official record marks the passing of a duchess who had been both maligned and effective. A woman who had managed households, raised children, negotiated contracts, and commissioned works that would outlast her. For those who lived near her, for the servants and artists and the clerks who kept her accounts, her death was a practical turning point. Pensions to be paid, properties to be redistributed, positions to be filled. For historians and the hungry public alike, it became another occasion to ask a familiar question. What, after all, had she been? Victim, villain, survivor, patron? Each label persisted because each served a storyteller's need more than it answered an archival fact. But the archival fact, if you look for it, is stubborn. Notarial books, letters, and financial records refuse to be sensational. They show a woman who, despite the cost of being a Borgia, carved out a niche of influence that was material and measurable. Endowments survived into civic life. Chapels she funded held masses long after her body was gone. Paintings she commissioned hung in palaces that outlived the scandals attached to their commissioner. These are the quiet rebellions of posterity, the ability of ordinary bureaucratic acts to outlast the roar of gossip. They are not glamorous, but they are the reason her name continued to appear in the ledgers of power long after the rumour mills had turned to new feasts. The afterlife of Lucrezia's image is itself a lesson in cultural appetite. In the centuries that followed, storytellers repurposed her into whatever myth suited them, an emblem of papal corruption for Protestant polemicists, a romantic femme fatale for novelists who loved dark passions, a subject for operatic melodrama that delighted audiences with titillation. Each retelling took liberties, drew on half-truths, and amplified what was already easy to believe. What is striking is not merely the cruelty of these distortions, but how they reveal the anxieties of each later age, fears about religion, about women with influence, about the mixing of sacred and secular power. Lucrezia, the historical person, becomes Lucrezia, the mirror. Each epoch sees in her a reflection of its own preoccupations. Yet in our time, with archives more accessible and historians more willing to interrogate evidence than to republish gossip, Lucrezia's narrative has been partially reclaimed. Scholars sifted through ledgers and letters, teased out patronage networks, and reconstructed the mundane architecture of her life. Biographies began to complicate the caricature, not to whitewash the Borgia family's aggression, but to situate Lucrezia inside the constraining logic of her era. The result is not innocence, but nuance. A portrait that recognizes both the coercive family structures that shaped her and the practical intelligence with which she navigated them. It is a recognition that agency can look like quiet administration as much as it can look like dramatic rebellion. This reassessment matters because it changes what we ask of historical figures. Instead of demanding that Lucrezia be either saint or sinner, we can ask how gendered expectations shaped the stories made about her. Why, for instance, did a rumour about a wedding night resonate so powerfully? The answer lies partly in the structural anxieties of Renaissance society. Women's bodies were public moral signifiers. A woman's sexuality could be turned into evidence of an entire family's corruption. The 3 times in one night whisper persists because it packaged a long political critique into a single, memorable image, a psychological shortcut that made complicated institutional critique digestible as scandal. It also matters because Lucrezia's story reveals the mechanics of historical reputation. Reputation is not merely what a person does, it is what others choose to record and circulate. Pamphleteers, diplomats, artists, and clerks all made choices about what to emphasize, what to amplify, what to omit. Those choices were shaped by immediate gain. A sensational story sells more copies. A flattering portrait attracts patrons. A documented gift secures loyalty. When we see how reputations are constructed, we also see how they can be deconstructed. The tools that built myth, stories, images, repetition, can be countered by patient archival work that reconstructs a life in its administrative, charitable, and familial details. Most importantly, Lucrezia's life forces us to confront uncomfortable continuities. The temptation to reduce powerful women to monsters or seductresses is not a relic of the past. Modern political discourse often recycles similar moves, simplifying complex actions into moral narratives, weaponizing private life against public competence, equating femininity with manipulative intent. Recognizing this continuity does not absolve individuals of wrongdoing, nor does it claim that Lucrezia was purely innocent. Rather, it sharpens our analysis. It asks us to be skeptical of narratives that trade nuance for outrage, and to value the slow, often boring work of reconstruction over the quick satisfaction of scandal. If there is a final image worth lingering on, it is not a bedchamber or a poison bottle, but a small, practical ledger entry, a payment authorised for a hospital, a pension guaranteed for a widow, a commission for a painter. Those entries are less thrilling than a pamphlet's headline, but they are more consequential. They show a woman who, in the margins of power, learned to protect what she could and to leave behind something that materially improved lives. In that sense, Lucrezia's legacy is paradoxically modest and radical. Modest because it is expressed in routine acts rather than grand gestures, and radical because those routine acts quietly resisted the storybook version of female power. History finally rewards complexity. Lucrezia Borgia will remain, for many, an alluring cipher, part tragic figure, part guilty party, part patron of the arts. But if we let her remain only a cipher, we lose the opportunity to see what power looks like when it must be negotiated in kitchens and chancelleries rather than won by open conquest. We lose the chance to learn how reputations are made and unmade, and how people, especially those constrained by gender and family obligation, find small, effective ways to make a life that matters. Lucrezia's real scandal, if it can be called that, was not in some lurid excess, but in surviving the era's violence with enough resourcefulness to rewrite, in part, her own story. The rest is the work of us, historians, storytellers, and listeners, to notice the difference between what captivated the crowd and what actually changed lives. And so the question lingers like a whisper in the corridors of history. Why did the myth of Lucrezia Borgia survive with such intensity when the truth of her life was, in so many ways, ordinary? Why do people still speak of her with the same mixture of fascination and suspicion centuries after her bones were laid to rest? The answer, perhaps, lies less in who Lucrezia was and more in what humanity craves in its stories. Scandal is a shortcut. It collapses complexity into something consumable, something that can be repeated over wine or scribbled in a margin 3 times in one night. A single line that conveys lust, power, danger, and corruption all at once. A myth like that requires no context. It does not demand the patient sifting of archives or the parsing of family politics. It gives us a simple way to feel morally superior to the past. In contrast, the truth of ledgers and letters, of patronage and survival, is harder to narrate. It is subtle, slow, layered. We are not naturally drawn to the careful arithmetic of governance. We are drawn to the theatre of rumour. Lucrezia's survival in cultural memory proves this. She endures because she embodies the eternal tug between scandal and substance. And yet, if we look closer, there is a strange justice in how history treats her. Though she was maligned, she also became immortal. Countless other women of her station, who lived dutiful, unscandalous lives, disappeared into the anonymity of genealogical tables. But Lucrezia, by virtue of the myths cast upon her, remained vivid in the imagination of Europe. In being demonized, she was also preserved. Every slander, every tale of poison and forbidden passion ensured that her name would not fade. It is a cruel immortality, but it is immortality nonetheless. What remains remarkable is that beneath the noise, fragments of her real self continue to glimmer through. A contract here, a letter there. The brushstroke of an artist's portrait. These fragments refuse to be silenced, whispering to us across the centuries that there was more to her than the pamphlets declared. They remind us that history is not only written by the victors, it is also written by the gossipers, the moralists, and the opportunists. And our task, if we are willing, is to listen for the quieter truths that survive despite them. Lucrezia's story, in the end, is not merely about her. It is about the power of narrative itself. It shows us how societies construct monsters when they need them, how reputations become political weapons, and how gendered expectations turn women into screens upon which entire cultures project their anxieties. Her wedding night became a parable not because of what actually happened, but because it symbolized everything people wanted to believe about corruption, decadence, and female cunning. It was not history, it was theatre masquerading as fact. But theatre fades and paper burns. What does not fade are the structures she left behind. Institutions funded by her charity, children who carried her lineage, alliances that shaped the map of Italy. The scandal has entertainment value, but the substance had enduring effect. And so, when we retell her story, we must ask ourselves, do we want to be the audience who repeats the rumour, or the archivists who preserve the truth? Perhaps the most unsettling lesson of all is this. Lucrezia Borgia was neither the monster nor the angel that history alternately painted her to be. She was instead profoundly human. She made compromises to survive, seized what influence she could, endured losses, and tried to stitch meaning out of the fragments life handed her. That ordinariness, in a way, is more terrifying than the myth, because it reminds us that history is not built by gods or demons, but by flawed, complicated people whose lives resist neat categories. So the scandal of Lucrezia Borgia lives on, not because it was true, but because it was useful. Useful to her enemies, useful to pamphleteers, useful to generations of storytellers hungry for a femme fatale. And yet when we look past the theatre, we find a woman who lived through upheaval with resourcefulness, who built where she could, who mothered, governed, prayed and persisted. That, more than anything, is her true legacy.